Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to be diving into Napoleon's Russian campaign of 1812.
Ooh, a fascinating choice.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon, brilliant military mind, right?
Okay.
But even the best can miscalculate.
Oh, for sure.
And this campaign, this is a case study in just how badly things can go wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so picture this.
Yeah.
Over 600,000 soldiers marching into this just vast expanse of Russia.
It's incredible.
It's audacious, it's ambitious, and as we'll see, it's ultimately a disaster of epic proportions.
What I find captivating about this story is that it's not just a clash of armies.
Right.
It's a clash of personalities and empires.
Oh, okay.
You have Napoleon at the height of his power, convinced of his own invincibility.
Oh, yeah.
Going head-to-head with Tsar Alexander I of Russia, a shrewd leader who knew how to use his nation's vastness to his advantage. And lurking beneath it all, this kind of simmering tension between these two figures.
Okay.
This fractured alliance that set the stage for this monumental conflict.
So it wasn't just a border dispute that sparked this whole thing.
Well,
There was personal animosity, too.
absolutely.
Oh, wow.
There were political and economic factors, of course.
Right.
Napoleon's continental system, designed to cripple Britain's economy, put a strain on Russia.
Okay.
And then there were disagreements over territories like Poland,
Right.
and even a rejected marriage proposal
from
Napoleon to one of Alexander's sisters.
He proposed to the Tsar's sister.
He did, and it was not well received.
Oh, wow.
These personal slights added fuel to the fire, creating this volatile mix of pride, ambition, and mistrust.
Wow. So the relationship's already strained, and then Napoleon decides to assemble the Grande Armée, this massive force of over 600,000 men drawn from all across Europe. I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of it.
Did he really think he could just march into Russia and take over?
While Napoleon was known for his bold maneuvers, his decisive victories, but even his most seasoned advisors were skeptical of this plan. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented.
Yeah.
Imagine the logistical nightmare of feeding, supplying, and coordinating that many soldiers,
Oh, my gosh.
many of whom didn't even speak French.
Wow. And the Russians, they weren't just going to sit back and watch this massive army roll in, were they?
Not at all. The Russians, though outnumbered, they had a few tricks up their sleeve.
Okay.
They knew they couldn't defeat Napoleon in a direct confrontation, at least not initially, so they adopted a strategy of strategic retreat and what's known as scorched earth.
Scorched earth.
Yeah.
Sounds brutal.
It was. As the French army advanced, the Russians would retreat, burning crops, destroying bridges, poisoning wells,
Oh.
leaving nothing for the invaders.
Wow.
They would even evacuate entire towns and villages,
Really?
denying Napoleon any local support or resources.
So Napoleon's army is marching deeper and deeper into Russia, constantly harassed by these elusive Cossack horsemen, facing dwindling supplies.
It was a recipe for disaster.
Feels like it, yeah.
Grueling campaign right from the start. The summer heat was oppressive, the terrain was challenging, and the relentless attacks by the Cossacks.
Right.
These incredibly skilled, mobile horsemen, they wore down the French troops and disrupted their supply lines. Napoleon was a master of winning battles, but this was a war of attrition.
Oh.
A war against the elements and the vastness of Russia itself.
And still,
Yeah.
Napoleon pressed on deeper into Russia. He was determined to force a decisive confrontation with the Russian army,
It was almost like an obsession.
which eventually came, right?
The
Battle of Borodino.
Exactly. Borodino fought in September of 1812.
Okay.
Brutal, bloody affair.
Oh, I bet.
One of the deadliest single days of fighting in the entire Napoleonic Wars.
Oh.
Both sides suffered horrendous casualties, but it was a tactical victory for Napoleon,
Okay.
albeit a costly one.
But wasn't there a controversial decision he made during the battle?
Yeah.
Something about his elite imperial guard?
Ah, yes, the decision to hold back his imperial guard.
Right.
Napoleon had this reserve force of highly trained, experienced soldiers, his best of the best.
Yeah.
And at a crucial moment in the battle, when it seemed like a decisive push could break the Russian lines, he hesitated.
Oh, really?
He held back the guard. Perhaps out of concern for their safety, perhaps an overestimation of his army's strength. To this day, historians debate whether unleashing the guard at that moment could have changed the course of the battle,
Wow.
and perhaps the entire campaign.
Wow. So even in victory, there were seeds of doubt, these missed opportunities.
It's a turning point, really.
What happened after Borodino?
Well,
Did Napoleon finally achieve his goal of capturing Moscow?
he did.
Okay.
But it was a hollow victory.
Oh.
The Russians, under the command of General Kutuzov, chose to abandon Moscow rather than defend it.
Okay.
As Napoleon entered the city expecting, this grand surrender,
Right.
the keys to the Russian Empire,
Yeah.
he found, a ghost town.
Early.
Engulfed in flames.
He walked into a burning city.
He did.
The Russians had set fire to their own capital.
They had. It was a bold and devastating move.
Wow.
A way of saying, you may have taken our city, but you will gain nothing from it. You will not break our spirit.
Wow, that's powerful.
It was a turning point, not just strategically, but psychologically.
Right.
For Napoleon, the burning of Moscow was a sign that this campaign, this invasion that he had staked so much on, was slipping from his grasp.
It must have been a devastating blow.
It was, to realize his grand plan was unraveling.
Yeah.
He lingered in Moscow for weeks, hoping for a negotiated settlement with Tsar Alexander, but those hopes were in vain. Winter was fast approaching, and with it, the threat of dwindling supplies and the infamous Russian winter.
Right.
Napoleon was faced with a stark choice: stay in a burning, hostile city, or retreat back through a ravaged landscape with a diminished army pursued by a resurgent enemy.
It sounds like Napoleon was caught in a trap of his own making.
Indeed. His ambition led him deep into enemy territory, and now the land itself seemed to be turning against him.
Wow.
The stage was set for one of the most harrowing retreats in military history.
So Napoleon, he finds himself in Moscow, and this once great city, not a smoldering ruin.
Yeah.
He's got this, dwindling army, the Russian winter's closing in, no sign of surrender from the Tsar. I mean, what's going through his mind at this point?
Well, imagine the weight of expectation, right? He built this reputation, on this string of victories, this aura of invincibility.
Right.
And now, for the first time, she's facing this major setback.
Right.
And the stakes couldn't have been higher.
Yeah.
His decision in Moscow, whether to stay or to retreat, it would determine the fate of his army.
Wow.
And perhaps his own legacy.
Yeah. It must have been just a crushing blow to his ego to realize that his gamble had backfired so spectacularly.
Absolutely. And his frustration, it was compounded by the fact that the Russians, they refused to play by his rules. They wouldn't engage in the kind of decisive battle he was accustomed to winning.
Right.
They were fighting a different kind of war.
Yeah.
A war of attrition, of patience.
Right.
Exploiting, the vastness of their land and the brutality of their winter.
It's like they turned their own geography into a weapon.
Precisely.
A weapon Napoleon just had no answer for.
And while Napoleon was trying to figure out his next move, the Russian leadership, particularly Kutuzov, they were already several steps ahead.
Okay.
They knew the French were vulnerable, their morale was shaken, their supplies were dwindling, and they were prepared to make the French pay dearly for every step they took back towards their own borders.
This is where we really start to see the horrors of the retreat begin, right? Temperatures plummeting, soldiers freezing to death, starving, succumbing to disease.
It was a descent into a nightmare.
Yeah.
Imagine, hundreds of thousands of men.
Yeah.
Exhausted, demoralized, trudging through knee-deep snow. Their uniforms in tatters, their boots falling apart.
Yeah.
Food was scarce. Ammunition was running low.
Right.
And every night, the temperature would drop to levels that could kill a man in hours.
I can only imagine the chaos and desperation.
It was every man for himself.
Wow.
Soldiers were abandoning their units, scavenging for scraps.
Right.
And even turning on each other.
Oh, wow.
The once mighty Grande Armée was disintegrating into this desperate mob, hounded by Cossacks, pursued by the relentless Russian army.
And Napoleon, where was he during all of this? Was he leading his troops through this ordeal?
Well, that's another controversial aspect of this story.
Okay.
As the situation grew increasingly dire, Napoleon made this, fateful decision.
Okay.
He would abandon his army and return to Paris.
He left his men behind. Seriously.
He did.
Wow.
Some argue it was a necessary move.
Oh.
That he needed to return to France to stabilize the political situation, raise a new army. Others see it as an act of cowardice, a betrayal of the soldiers who had risked their lives for him.
Right.
Whatever the motivation, his departure had a profound impact on the morale of the remaining troops.
I bet.
Their leader, the man they'd followed into the heart of Russia, had deserted them.
I can't imagine how demoralizing that must have been for those soldiers who were left behind.
It was a crushing blow, but even amidst the despair, there were moments of incredible courage and resilience.
Right.
Think of Marshal Ney, leading the rear guard, fending off those pursuing Russians with a handful of exhausted troops.
Wow.
Or the desperate crossing of the Berezina River, where thousands perished in the icy waters trying to escape that Russian onslaught. These were acts of extraordinary human endurance. But they couldn't change the fact that the campaign was a catastrophic failure.
Yeah. It's hard to fathom the sheer scale of suffering and loss during this retreat. Hundreds of thousands of men lost their lives. What impact did this have on Napoleon's reputation, on his image as this invincible conqueror?
The Russian campaign, it shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility.
Yeah.
His enemies across Europe, who had been, cowed by his previous victories, they were emboldened. They saw that Napoleon could be beaten,
Right.
that his grand armies were not invincible. And within France, though he still had many supporters,
Right.
there were whispers of doubt, questions about his judgment, criticisms of his decision to abandon his troops.
So the cracks were beginning to show in this facade of power and dominance.
They were.
But even after this devastating defeat, Napoleon wasn't finished yet, was he?
Not at all.
Yeah.
He was a master of political maneuvering and military strategy.
Right.
He knew he had to rebuild his army, rally his allies, regain the initiative. The Russian campaign may have been a turning point, but the final chapter of the Napoleonic Wars was still being written.
It's incredible to think that even after this devastating loss in Russia, Napoleon was able to bounce back, raise another army, and continue fighting. How did he manage to, regain support and convince people to follow him after such a disaster?
It really is a testament to his personality and his political acumen.
Yeah.
He was a master of propaganda,
Right.
able to spin the narrative in his favor, downplaying the scale of the defeat, emphasizing the need for a united France against these external enemies. He appealed to national pride,
Right.
the glory of France. And his charisma and just sheer force of will, it still held sway over many.
But surely people were questioning his judgment, right, after the Russian debacle. Was he able to silence those critics?
Not entirely, of course. There were growing concerns about his ambition, his willingness to sacrifice French lives for his own glory.
Right.
But he was still Napoleon,
Right.
a figure who evoked both admiration and fear.
Yeah.
And he was able to suppress dissent and maintain a grip on power, at least for a time.
What about his allies? Were they still willing to support him after what happened in Russia?
Some remained loyal, particularly those who had benefited from his rule
Right.
or saw him as a bulwark against their own enemies.
Yeah.
But the cracks were definitely showing in his alliances.
Okay.
The Prussians and the Austrians,
Yeah.
who had previously been forced to side with him, they were sensing weakness. They were exploring their options.
Right.
They saw an opportunity to break free from Napoleon's dominance and reclaim their own power.
So the balance of power was shifting.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the key events that followed the Russian campaign? What was the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, for Napoleon's empire?
Well, the turning point came in 1813 with the Battle of Leipzig,
Okay.
also known as the Battle of Nations.
Wow.
It was this massive clash of armies involving hundreds of thousands of troops from across Europe.
Wow.
Napoleon faced this coalition of his enemies, the British, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, all united against him.
So he was outnumbered and surrounded.
Essentially, yes. And while he fought with his usual tactical brilliance, the odds were stacked against him.
Yeah.
His army, though still formidable, it was a shadow of its former self, depleted by the losses in Russia and the, growing reluctance of some of his allies to fully commit to his cause.
What was the outcome of the battle?
It was a decisive defeat for Napoleon. His forces were shattered, and he was forced to retreat back to France, his aura of invincibility gone, his empire crumbling around him.
The end of an era. What happened to Napoleon after this final defeat?
He abdicated in 1814 and was exiled to the island of Elba,
Okay.
a relatively comfortable exile considering his past conquests.
Right.
But the story doesn't end there.
Okay.
In a dramatic twist, he escaped from Elba in 1815.
He did.
He did, returned to France, and attempted to regain power.
Wow.
This led to the famous 100 Days' War, this last desperate gamble to reclaim his lost glory.
And of course, this all culminated in the Battle of Waterloo, the final showdown.
Exactly. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced this combined British and Prussian army led by the Duke of Wellington. It was a close-fought battle. But in the end, Napoleon was defeated, decisively and irrevocably. This time, there would be no escape, no second chances.
So what became of Napoleon after Waterloo?
He was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. far from the battlefields of Europe and the centers of power he had once dominated. He died there in 1821, a fallen emperor, a legend in his own time, but a figure whose legacy continues to be debated and dissected to this day.
What a fascinating and tragic story. From the heights of power to the depths of defeat, Napoleon's life was this whirlwind of ambition, brilliance, and ultimately hubris.
He was a complex and contradictory figure, a military genius who revolutionized warfare,
Yeah.
a reformer who modernized France, but also a ruthless conqueror who caused immense suffering and destabilized Europe for decades. His story is a reminder of the seductive nature of power, the allure of glory, and the dangers of unchecked ambition.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey through one of the most fascinating and tumultuous periods in European history. We've explored the complexities of Napoleon's character, the brilliance of his military campaigns, and the ultimate tragedy of his downfall. And for you, dear listener, we hope this exploration has sparked your curiosity about this era, encouraging you to delve deeper into the stories, the battles, and the personalities that shaped the course of history. Keep learning, keep questioning, and until next time, keep diving deep.